June 4, 1942, 400 nautical miles northwest of Midway Atoll. Lieutenant Commander Mitsuo Fuchida stood on the flight deck of the carrier Akagi, watching the morning sun climb above the Pacific horizon. Around him, deck crews prepared strike aircraft for a second attack on Midway Island. The first wave had returned with reports of success, but incomplete destruction. American defenses remained operational. Another strike was necessary. Fuchida, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack 6 months earlier, felt confident despite the morning's complications. Japanese naval aviation remained undefeated. In every engagement from Pearl Harbor to the Indian Ocean, Japanese carrier forces had achieved victory. The 4 carriers of the First Air Fleet, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, represented the most powerful naval striking force ever assembled. Together they carried over 200 aircraft operated by the finest naval aviators in the world. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Most importantly, they carried the Mitsubishi A-6M0 fighter, the aircraft that had revolutionized naval aviation and given Japan absolute air superiority across the Pacific. Japanese naval planners believed that 300 Zero fighters, the approximate number available across all 4 carriers and land bases supporting the Midway operation, could defend against any American attack. This belief, this unshakable confidence in Japanese air superiority, would be shattered in 5 minutes of combat that would change the course of the Pacific War. The Zero fighter had earned its legendary status through 18 months of combat dominance that seemed to defy the laws of aerial warfare. Introduced to combat in China in 1940, the Zero had achieved kill ratios that American intelligence officers initially dismissed as propaganda. When the Zero first encountered American pilots in combat during the Philippines campaign following Pearl Harbor, the results were catastrophic for American forces. P-40 Warhawk fighters, America's frontline fighter in the Pacific, were slaughtered by Zeros in lopsided engagements that shocked American commanders. In the first week of combat over the Philippines, American fighter squadrons lost 75% of their aircraft. Surviving pilots reported an enemy fighter that could outmaneuver anything they had encountered, that could climb faster than seemed physically possible, that could dogfight at altitudes where American engines struggled for power. The Zero's specifications explained its dominance. Maximum speed of 331 miles per hour at 16,000 feet made it competitive with any fighter in the world. But speed was not the Zero's primary advantage. The aircraft's phenomenal maneuverability came from extreme lightness achieved through design philosophy that prioritized performance over pilot protection. The Zero weighed 5,147 pounds fully loaded, nearly 2,000 pounds lighter than the American F-4F Wildcat carrier fighter. This weight advantage translated directly into combat capability. The Zero could turn inside any opponent, climb at rates exceeding 4,000 feet per minute, and remain effective at altitudes above 30,000 feet, where heavier American fighters became sluggish. Rate of climb, turning radius, combat ceiling, these performance characteristics matter more than maximum speed in dogfighting, where positioning determines survival. The Zero excelled in all of them. Japanese pilots exploited these advantages ruthlessly. Standard Zero tactics involved forcing American fighters into turning combat, where Japanese aircraft superiority became overwhelming. American pilots who accepted turning combat died. Those who survived learned to avoid dogfighting entirely, developing tactics that emphasized diving attacks, followed by immediate retreat to preserve speed advantages. But these tactics required discipline that newly trained American pilots often lacked, leading to continued losses throughout early 1942. The Zero's armament matched its maneuverability. Two 20mm cannons mounted in the wings provided devastating firepower at close range. Two 7.7mm machine guns in the fuselage supplemented the cannons for longer-range engagements. A single burst from a Zero's cannons could shred an enemy aircraft, tearing control surfaces, exploding fuel tanks, killing pilots in their cockpits. American aircraft, built with more robust construction and protected fuel tanks, could sometimes absorb machine gun hits and remain airborne. But 20mm cannon shells destroyed aircraft regardless of structural strength. The psychological impact of the Zero extended beyond physical, performance characteristics. Japanese pilots operating these aircraft were supremely confident, veterans of years of combat in China and months of operations across the Pacific. They had defeated every opponent they had encountered. They believed, with considerable justification, that they were the finest fighter pilots in the world flying the finest fighter aircraft ever built. This confidence translated into aggressive tactics, fearless attacks, and relentless pursuit of enemy aircraft. American pilots, many with only months of training, faced opponents with years of experience who flew superior aircraft and believed themselves invincible. The Battle of Midway approached with Japanese confidence at its peak. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, had planned the operation as a decisive engagement to destroy remaining American carrier forces and force negotiations that would end the Pacific War on Japanese terms. The plan was complex, involving multiple tasks, forces, feints toward the Aleutian Islands, and the main carrier striking force approaching Midway from the northwest. Yamamoto expected American carriers to respond to the Midway attack, sailing into a trap where Japanese numerical superiority and tactical skill would achieve decisive victory. Japanese planning documents estimated American carrier strength at 2, possibly 3 flat tops. Intelligence suggested that the carrier, Yorktown, damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea 1 month earlier, remained under repair and could not participate. This assessment was incorrect. American codebreakers, operating from a basement facility at Pearl Harbor, had cracked Japanese naval codes and provided Admiral Chester Nimitz with remarkably detailed information about Japanese plans. Nimitz positioned 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, northeast of Midway, in ambush positions. The Japanese, expecting surprise, sailed directly into a trap, but even with this intelligence advantage, American forces faced daunting odds. Japanese carrier aircraft outnumbered American aircraft significantly. Japanese pilots possessed far more combat experience. Most critically, Japanese fighters enjoyed performance advantages that American commanders understood would result in heavy losses for any attacking force. American torpedo bombers, slow and vulnerable, would be slaughtered by Zeros. American dive bombers, faster and more survivable, would still face intense fighter opposition. American fighter escorts, flying inferior F-4F Wildcats, would struggle to protect bombers against more maneuverable Zeros. The mathematics of the coming battle favored Japan overwhelmingly. June 4th began with Japanese confidence undimmed despite growing complications. The first strike against Midway had launched before dawn, 108 aircraft attacking the island's facilities. The strike commander, Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, radioed back that a second attack was necessary to complete suppression of island defenses. This message created the first critical decision point. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commanding the carrier striking force, ordered aircraft aboard his carriers that had been armed with anti-ship weapons to be rearmed with land attack bombs for the second Midway strike. The rearming process would require 90 minutes. During this window, his carriers would be vulnerable, but Nagumo believed the risk was acceptable. His carriers possessed 300 Zero fighters across the 4 flat tops and land bases. American carriers, if they were present, could launch perhaps 150 aircraft total. Half would be torpedo bombers and dive bombers, vulnerable to fighter attack. The other half would be fighters attempting to protect bombers. Nagumo's Zeros would slaughter the bombers and drive off the fighters. This calculation, based on accurate understanding of relative aircraft numbers and performance characteristics, seemed mathematically sound. Japanese naval doctrine emphasized offensive action. Carriers existed to strike enemy targets, not to remain on defensive. The rearming operation proceeded with organized efficiency that reflected years of training and combat experience. Deck crews worked rapidly, removing torpedoes from aircraft, lowering them to magazines, bringing up land attack bombs, mounting them on aircraft. The process was methodical, practiced, executed with precision. Nobody questioned the decision. Nagumo had fought across the Pacific without defeat. His judgment had proven sound in every engagement. Then, at 7:28 in the morning, everything changed. A Japanese scout plane radioed a report that electrified the flagship. 10 ships, apparently enemy, bearing 10 degrees, distance 240 miles from Midway. American surface vessels, possibly including carriers, had been located. The report was incomplete, frustratingly vague about ship types, but the implications were clear. American carriers might be present. Nagumo faced an agonizing decision. He could continue rearming for the second Midway strike, completing the operation that was already underway. Or he could halt rearming, rearm again with anti-ship weapons, and prepare to strike the American fleet. The decision required perhaps 30 minutes to execute either option. 30 minutes that would determine the battle's outcome. He waited for additional information. At 8:09, the scout plane finally reported, "Enemy force accompanied by what appears to be a carrier." Now, Nagumo had confirmation. American carriers were present. He immediately ordered rearming operations reversed. Anti-ship weapons would replace land attack bombs. The strike would target the American fleet. But the timing was catastrophic. Aircraft were distributed across hangar decks with armaments in various states of readiness. Some aircraft still carried land attack bombs. Others had been rearmed with torpedoes. Still others sat with no weapons mounted, waiting for ordnance that was being moved from magazines. The flight decks were cluttered with aircraft, fuel lines, and ordnance carts. Recovery operations for the first Midway strike were still ongoing. Returning aircraft landed continuously, taxiing forward to make room for following aircraft. The confusion was manageable, but required time to resolve. Time that was rapidly running out because American torpedo bombers had found the Japanese carriers. At 9:25, the first American attack developed. Torpedo Squadron 8 from the carrier Hornet, led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, attacked without fighter escort. The squadron consisted of 15 TBD Devastator torpedo bombers, obsolete aircraft that cruised at 115 miles per hour and required straight, level approach runs to drop torpedoes. These aircraft, attacking alone without fighter protection, faced the full attention of Japanese fighter defenses. Zero fighters fell upon the torpedo bombers like wolves attacking sheep. The Devastators, slow and unmaneuverable with torpedoes slung beneath their fuselages, could not evade or fight back effectively. Zeros attacked from every angle, pouring 20mm cannon fire into American aircraft. Within minutes, all 15 Devastators were shot down, every single aircraft destroyed. 29 of 30 aircrew killed. Only Ensign George Gay survived, floating in the water and watching the battle unfold. The slaughter of Torpedo Squadron 8 seemed to validate Japanese confidence in the Zero's supremacy. American torpedo bombers, attacking without adequate fighter escort, had been annihilated without inflicting any damage on Japanese carriers. 0 pilots, their confidence soaring, prepared to repeat the performance against subsequent attacks. They did not wait long. Torpedo Squadron, 6 from Enterprise, and Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown attacked within the next 30 minutes. Both squadrons suffered catastrophic losses. Torpedo 6 lost 10 of 14 aircraft. Torpedo 3 lost 10 of 12 aircraft. The combined American torpedo attacks, 41 aircraft total, achieved 0 hits on Japanese carriers and lost 35 aircraft, an 85% loss rate that represented one of the most lopsided aerial combat results in history. Japanese pilots, exultant, believed they had broken the American attack. They had shot down dozens of American aircraft without sustaining significant damage to their carriers. The Americans had committed their strike forces and achieved nothing. Now Japanese carriers could recover fighters, rearm, strike aircraft, and launch their own devastating counterattack against American flat tops. What Japanese pilots and commanders did not realize was that the torpedo attacks, despite achieving no hits, had accomplished something strategically invaluable. The prolonged low-level attacks had pulled Japanese fighter defenses down to wave-top level. Zeros that normally maintained altitude to intercept incoming strikes had descended to sea level to engage torpedo bombers. Japanese fighter directors, focusing attention on the immediate threat of torpedoes, had lost track of the broader tactical situation. High above the chaos of low-level combat, unobserved and unmolested, 3 squadrons of American dive bombers were approaching attack positions. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading the Enterprise Air Group, had made a critical navigation decision earlier that morning. When his initial search failed to locate Japanese carriers at their expected position, McCluskey had continued southwest, gambling that the Japanese fleet was further west than anticipated. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. At 9:55, McCluskey spotted the wake of a Japanese destroyer racing northeast. He followed the wake, betting that the destroyer was rejoining the main fleet. 10 minutes later, at 10:05, McCluskey saw the Japanese carrier force spread below him, 4 carriers in a box formation, their decks crowded with aircraft in various stages of rearming and refueling. It was the perfect target. McCluskey immediately deployed his dive bombers for attack. The timing was extraordinarily fortunate. Just minutes earlier, Japanese carriers had begun recovering Zero fighters that had massacred American torpedo squadrons. The Zeros, low on fuel and ammunition after prolonged combat, landed quickly to rearm. Flight decks were crowded with aircraft, fuel lines, and ordnance. Worse, the carriers were in the midst of rearming strike aircraft for attacks on American carriers. Torpedoes, bombs, and aviation fuel were distributed across hangar decks and flight decks in quantities that turned each carrier into a floating bomb. At approximately 10:22, McCluskey's dive bombers rolled into their attacks. SBD Dauntless dive bombers, each carrying a single 1,000-pound bomb, screamed down from 17,000 feet at speeds approaching 250 miles per hour. The Dauntless was not a spectacular aircraft. It was slower than fighters, less maneuverable than dedicated attack planes, and carried relatively modest bomb loads. But it excelled at its specialized role of dive bombing, incorporating features that made it exceptionally accurate. Perforated dive brakes allowed the aircraft to maintain controlled dives at steep angles without exceeding structural limits. Pilots could aim their entire aircraft at the target, releasing bombs at altitudes below 2,000 feet, where accuracy was excellent. The Dauntless was stable, predictable, and forgiving, allowing even relatively inexperienced pilots to achieve respectable hit probabilities. against ships maneuvering violently with anti-aircraft fire filling the sky. Hit probabilities of 20 to 30% were considered excellent. Against stationary targets, hit probabilities approached 50%. The Japanese carriers, focused on recovering fighters and rearming strike aircraft, were not maneuvering radically. They maintained formation, presenting ideal targets for dive bombers. Japanese lookouts spotted the American dive bombers at the last moment, screaming warnings that came too late to matter. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire, filling the sky with explosive shells and tracer rounds. But American dive bombers were already committed to their attack runs, hurtling downward at angles too steep for meaningful evasive action. The first bombs struck Akagi at approximately 10:22. The carrier, Admiral Nagumo's flagship, took at least 2 direct hits. One bomb penetrated the flight deck near the aft elevator, exploding in the hangar bay where armed aircraft waited for launch. The detonation triggered secondary explosions as torpedoes, bombs, and aviation fuel ignited. Within seconds, the hangar bay became an inferno. Fire spread rapidly through passages and ventilation shafts. Damage control parties struggled to contain blazes that exceeded their capacity to fight. Simultaneously, bombs struck Kaga. This massive carrier, converted from a battleship hull and one of the largest flat tops in the Japanese Navy, suffered multiple hits. At least 4 bombs struck the carrier in rapid succession. The impacts shattered flight decks, penetrated into hangar spaces, and ignited the same volatile combination of fuel and ordnance that was destroying Akagi. Explosions ripped through Kaga's hull as armed aircraft detonated, their bombs and torpedoes adding to the devastation. The carrier's massive size, which provided advantages in aircraft capacity and operational flexibility, now worked against survival. Large hangar bays filled with smoke and flame. Fire spread rapidly through a hull with hundreds of compartments and passages. Soryu, the third carrier in the formation, suffered perhaps the most complete destruction. 3 bombs struck within seconds, overwhelming damage control capabilities instantly. Fires erupted across the flight deck and in hangar spaces. The carrier's relatively small size, just 16,000 tons displacement, meant that 3 bomb hits represented overwhelming damage. There was simply not enough ship to absorb the punishment. Within minutes of being hit, Soryu was clearly doomed. The 3 carriers, Japan's premier naval assets and veterans of Pearl Harbor, the Indian Ocean Raid, and numerous operations across 6 months of war, had been transformed from powerful warships into burning wrecks in approximately 5 minutes. The time from first bomb impact to last was less than 5 minutes. In those 5 minutes, Japanese naval aviation was effectively destroyed. The speed of destruction shocked Japanese survivors. Officers who had served on these carriers for years, who had participated in training exercises where carriers had survived hypothetical attacks, could not comprehend how quickly their ships had been reduced to blazing hulks. The devastation exceeded anything in their experience or training. Fires raged out of control. Explosions continued as fuel tanks and magazines detonated. Structural failures occurred as heat weakened steel bulkheads and decks. The carriers were dying, taking with them decades of institutional knowledge, hundreds of irreplaceable aircraft, and thousands of highly trained personnel. Admiral Nagumo, aboard the burning Akagi, transferred his flag to a cruiser and watched helplessly as his flagship died. The sight was almost incomprehensible. Akagi had been the pride of the Japanese Navy, the carrier from which the Pearl Harbor attack had been launched, a ship that symbolized Japanese naval dominance. Now she burned uncontrollably, racked by explosions, clearly beyond saving. Kaga and Soryu suffered similar fates. Both carriers burned. Intensely, their crews fighting desperately to control fires that could not be controlled. Damage control parties died attempting to contain blazes that consumed oxygen and generated heat exceeding human tolerance. Sailors abandoned ship as commanders recognized that remaining aboard meant certain death. The fourth carrier, Hiryu, operating separately several miles away from her sister carriers, had escaped the initial American dive bomber attack. Her fighter defenses remained intact. Her strike aircraft were operational. Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, commanding Hiryu and known for aggressive tactics, immediately ordered counterattacks against American carriers. If one Japanese carrier remained operational, perhaps the battle could still be salvaged. Hiryu launched 2 strikes against American carriers that afternoon. The first strike found the carrier Yorktown, hitting her with 3 bombs that caused significant damage but did not sink her. The second strike, launched hours later, found Yorktown again and hit her with 2 torpedoes that finally doomed the American carrier. These attacks demonstrated that Japanese naval aviation remained potent, but the strategic situation had changed irreversibly. American dive bombers from Enterprise found Hiryu late that afternoon. The carrier, having launched her strike aircraft and recovered her fighters, was vulnerable. American dive bombers attacked, hitting Hiryu with 4 bombs that started fires similar to those that had destroyed her sister ships. By evening, Hiryu was burning out of control. Admiral Yamaguchi, accepting responsibility for the disaster and following Japanese martial traditions, chose to go down with his ship rather than survive defeat. By midnight on June 4th, all 4 Japanese carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier were burning or sinking. Akagi, abandoned by her crew, burned through the night before being scuttled by Japanese destroyers. Kaga exploded and sank early on June 5th. Soryu capsized and sank in the evening. Hiryu, the last to fall, burned through the night before, sinking on the morning of June 5th. The Japanese had lost 4 fleet carriers, 248 aircraft, and over 3,000 sailors, including hundreds of irreplaceable pilots and maintenance personnel. American losses, while significant, were far less severe. The carrier Yorktown, damaged by Japanese counterstrikes, would be sunk by a Japanese submarine several days later. 1 destroyer was also sunk. 307 Americans died. 150 American aircraft were lost. But America retained 2 operational carriers, Enterprise and Hornet. More importantly, America retained the industrial capacity to replace losses quickly. Japan could not replace 4 fleet carriers or their highly trained air crews at any speed that mattered strategically. The battle was a crushing defeat that shifted strategic balance in the Pacific permanently. The mythology around the Zero fighter survived the battle initially. Japanese pilots who survived, and many did not, reported that they had shot down dozens of American aircraft. These claims were accurate. Zero pilots had indeed slaughtered American torpedo bombers, but the torpedo attacks, though tactically unsuccessful, had created conditions that allowed dive bombers to strike unmolested. The 300 Zero fighters that Japanese planners had believed would provide invincible defense had been pulled out of position at the critical moment. Japanese naval aviation never recovered from Midway. The loss of 4 carriers was damaging. The loss of aircraft was serious, but the loss of trained air crews was catastrophic. Japanese naval aviation training programs were lengthy, demanding, and produced relatively few graduates each year. The pilots killed at Midway, many with years of combat experience, could not be replaced in less than 18 months of intensive training, assuming facilities, fuel, and instructors were available. As the war continued, Japanese pilot quality declined steadily. Newly trained pilots with minimal flight hours faced American aviators, who were gaining experience and flying increasingly capable aircraft. The tables turned completely. By 1944, American pilots in improved fighters like the F-6F Hellcat were achieving kill ratios against Japanese fighters that exceeded 10-1. The Zero, once invincible, became a liability. Its light construction, which had provided such extraordinary maneuverability, meant that any hits from American .50 caliber machine guns could prove fatal. American fighters, built with armor protection, self-sealing fuel tanks, and robust structures, could absorb damage and return to carriers. Zeros, hit by even a few bullets, often exploded or burned. Japanese pilots, once supremely confident, became cautious and defensive. American pilots, gaining skill and flying superior aircraft, became aggressive and dominant. The transformation was complete. The Battle of Midway demonstrated that air superiority, even overwhelming tactical air superiority, represented by 300 Zero fighters, could not guarantee victory if strategic positioning and timing favored the opponent. American dive bombers, attacking at the perfect moment when Japanese carriers were most vulnerable and Japanese fighters were out of position, achieved results that seemed impossible based on relative combat capabilities. The 5 minutes that destroyed 3 Japanese carriers represented one of the most dramatic reversals in military history. Japanese forces had entered the battle, confident, experienced, equipped with superior fighters, and possessing numerical advantages. They left the battle defeated, their carriers sinking, their confidence shattered, their strategic position irreversibly weakened. The Zero fighter, symbol of Japanese air supremacy, proved unable to prevent catastrophe when American forces exploited momentary advantages with devastating effectiveness. The battle's lessons extended beyond immediate tactical results. Industrial capacity, intelligence gathering, and strategic positioning mattered more than tactical superiority. Japan's highly trained pilots flying superior aircraft could not overcome American advantages in code-breaking, strategic deployment, and, crucially, industrial capacity that would replace American losses, while Japanese losses remained irreplaceable. The 300 Zero fighters that were supposed to guarantee Japanese victory had failed to prevent American dive bombers from striking at the precise moment when Japanese defenses were vulnerable. Admiral Yamamoto, observing the disaster from his flagship hundreds of miles away, understood immediately that the battle had changed everything. His prediction, made before Pearl Harbor, that Japan could fight successfully for 6 months but faced uncertain prospects thereafter, had proven accurate, almost to the day. Midway occurred exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor. The defeat marked the end of Japanese offensive capability and the beginning of a long defensive retreat that would end 3 years later with complete defeat. The mythology of the Zero fighter persisted in Japanese propaganda throughout the war, but pilots who fought in the Pacific understood that American aircraft were improving rapidly, while Japanese aircraft remained essentially unchanged. The Zero that had dominated Pacific skies in early 1942 became obsolete by 1944, outclassed by American fighters that combined speed, firepower, and durability. Japanese attempts to develop improved fighters were hampered by material shortages, production difficulties, and declining industrial capacity. The Battle of Midway stands as perhaps history's finest example of how momentary tactical advantages can produce strategic results far exceeding apparent force ratios. 3 squadrons of American dive bombers, totaling fewer than 50 aircraft, destroyed 4 Japanese carriers defended by hundreds of aircraft, including 300 Zero fighters. The disparity between attacking force and defending force was enormous, yet the attackers achieved complete success while defenders failed utterly. The explanation lies not in superior American courage or skill, though both were present, but in timing, positioning, and intelligence. American codebreakers provided strategic intelligence that allowed carriers to be positioned perfectly. American torpedo bomber crews, though suffering catastrophic losses, pulled Japanese defenses out of position at precisely the right moment. American dive bomber commanders made navigation decisions that brought them over Japanese carriers at the instant of maximum vulnerability. These factors, combined with Japanese errors in tactical deployment and decision-making, created 5 minutes where American dive bombers faced minimal opposition and struck targets that could not sustain the damage inflicted. The result was disaster for Japan and victory for America. The 300 Zero fighters that were supposed to guarantee Japanese success instead witnessed American dive bombers destroying Japanese carriers, while Zero pilots fought at the wrong altitude against the wrong targets. The human cost of Midway was staggering for Japan. Over 3,000 sailors died when their carriers sank. Hundreds of pilots, many veterans of Pearl Harbor, and numerous subsequent operations were killed. The institutional knowledge lost when these experienced personnel died could never be recovered. Japanese naval aviation, after Midway, operated with steadily declining pilot quality, leading to increasing losses and decreasing effectiveness. By war's end, Japanese pilots were undertaking suicide attacks because conventional tactics against experienced American pilots flying superior aircraft had become suicidal anyway. The Battle of Air. Midway proved that industrial warfare required sustainable advantages. Tactical superiority, represented by the Zero's performance edge over American fighters, was insufficient if losses could not be replaced. Strategic advantages, represented by American industrial capacity and code-breaking capabilities, proved decisive despite temporary tactical disadvantages. The 300 Zeros, for all their superiority over American fighters, could not prevent defeat when American forces exploited intelligence advantages and struck at the moment of maximum Japanese vulnerability. Japan never recovered from Midway. The carriers lost were eventually replaced, but never in sufficient numbers to challenge American naval power after 1942. The pilots lost were replaced with increasingly inexperienced aviators who could not match American pilot quality. The strategic initiative lost at Midway never returned to Japanese hands. From June 4, 1942 forward, Japan fought defensive battles, retreating steadily across the Pacific, losing island after island. Watching American industrial might produce forces that overwhelmed Japanese resistance, regardless of courage or sacrifice displayed by Japanese forces. The 300 Zero fighters that were supposed to stop American raids instead participated in Japan's greatest naval defeat. The 5 minutes that destroyed 4 Japanese carriers changed the Pacific War irreversibly, demonstrating that tactical excellence and superior equipment could not overcome strategic advantages when timing, intelligence, and positioning favored the opponent. Midway was Japan's last chance to achieve favorable negotiated peace. After Midway, Japanese defeat became mathematically inevitable, requiring only time and American industrial production to achieve complete victory. The legacy of the Battle of Midway extends far beyond the confines of World War II. It was not merely a clash of ships and aircraft, but a decisive, turning point that reshaped the balance of power in the Pacific and redefined modern naval warfare. Midway endures as one of the most studied battles in military history because it encapsulates timeless lessons about intelligence, decision-making, and the limits of technological superiority. More than an account of victory and defeat, it remains a case study in how nations win wars, not through isolated moments of brilliance, but through strategic foresight, industrial strength, and the ability to adapt faster than their opponents. At its heart, Midway was a contest between two fundamentally different systems of warfare. Japan entered the battle with the confidence of a nation that had not yet lost a major engagement. Its forces had swept across the Pacific and Southeast Asia, capturing territory from Burma to the Philippines with astonishing speed. The Japanese naval air arm, led by pilots flying the highly maneuverable Mitsubishi A6M0, was widely regarded as the best in the world. The victories at Pearl Harbor, the fall of Singapore, and the conquest of the Dutch East Indies had given the Imperial Navy a sense of invincibility. Yet beneath the surface of triumph, the seeds of overreach were already germinating. Japan's wartime success had been built on tactical brilliance, not on strategic sustainability. The United States, in contrast, entered the Pacific War at a disadvantage. The destruction at Pearl Harbor had crippled much of its battleship fleet, leaving it seemingly vulnerable. Yet, even in the face of those losses, American strategists began to recognize that the nature of warfare had changed. The aircraft carrier, not the battleship, was now the decisive weapon of naval combat. Air power, mobility, and intelligence, not sheer tonnage or gun caliber, would determine the future. The U.S. Navy, under Admirals Chester W. Nimitz, Raymond Spruance, and Frank Jack Fletcher, understood that victory would not come from matching Japan, plane for plane or ship for ship, but from striking at the precise moment when the enemy was most exposed. That insight defined the Battle of Midway and continues to define the strategic doctrine of modern warfare. If one lesson stands above all others from Midway, it is the decisive role of intelligence. Prior to the battle, American cryptanalysts, led by Commander Joseph Rochefort at Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor, had broken portions of Japan's naval code, known as JN-25. Through patient and painstaking work, Rochefort's team was able to identify AF as the Japanese code designation for Midway Atoll. To confirm their hypothesis, the Americans staged a deception, ordering the base at Midway to send an unencrypted message reporting a breakdown in its freshwater system. When Japanese communications soon reported that AF is short on water, the ruse succeeded, confirming the target. This single act of intelligence brilliance allowed Admiral Nimitz to anticipate the Japanese plan with remarkable precision. He knew the approximate date, direction, and composition of the Japanese fleet before it even sailed. Thus, while the Japanese sought to ambush the remnants of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, it was they who were sailing into a trap. This episode demonstrated a truth that continues to resonate through every era of warfare. Information is power. Intelligence gathering matters more than tactical excellence because it determines when, where, and how that excellence can be applied. A fleet armed with superior aircraft and veteran pilots is of little use if it sails into an enemy's crosshairs unawares. Japan's planners, on the other hand, placed their faith in operational secrecy and the audacity of their plan. They believed that their complex, multi-pronged operation designed to seize Midway, draw the U.S. carriers into battle, and destroy them, would catch the Americans by surprise. Their confidence bordered on arrogance, for they assumed that what had worked at Pearl Harbor could work again. But the conditions of early 1942 no longer favored Japan. American resilience, coupled with superior intelligence, meant that Japan's strategic advantage was already eroding. The Battle of Midway also revealed the limits of tactical superiority. Japan's naval aviators were among the most skilled in the world, and their aircraft, especially the Zero fighter, were considered unmatched in maneuverability and range. Yet skill and technology, while crucial in short-term engagements, could not compensate for flawed strategy and misjudged timing. The Japanese fleet was scattered across a vast expanse of ocean, its forces divided between a main striking force, a diversionary group heading toward the Aleutians, and invasion units bound for Midway itself. This dispersion diluted their strength at the critical moment. By contrast, the American carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown were concentrated and positioned precisely where they needed to be. Nimitz's the decision to commit his limited forces decisively, rather than defensively, reflected an understanding that opportunity, not numerical strength, would decide the outcome. When the two forces finally clashed on the 4th of June 1942, fortune favored preparation. The sequence of events that followed has entered the realm of legend. At 10:22 a.m., in a span of just 5 minutes, American dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown found and struck 3 of Japan's 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, while their decks were crowded with fueled aircraft and armed bombs. The ensuing infernos were catastrophic. Hours later, the 4th carrier, Hiryu, was also fatally hit. In a single day, the Japanese combined fleet lost 4 frontline carriers, the cream of its air crews, and the strategic initiative in the Pacific. Those 5 minutes of combat destroyed 6 months of Japanese victories. What had been a sweeping offensive momentum turned almost instantly into a desperate defensive struggle. Japan's tactical superiority, the brilliance of its pilots, the sophistication of its tactics, had meant little once its carriers were caught off guard. Midway proved that wars are not won merely by fighting well, but by fighting smart. The right strike, delivered at the right time, outweighs months of cumulative advantage. Strategic positioning can overcome temporary disadvantages, just as poor positioning can render even the best-equipped forces vulnerable. Another enduring lesson of Midway concerns industrial capacity, the invisible force that often determines the outcome of prolonged conflicts. Japan's loss of 4 carriers and hundreds of trained aircrew could not be easily replaced. The Imperial Japanese Navy's pilot training program, designed for peacetime precision rather than wartime attrition, required years to produce a combat-ready aviator. Japan lacked both the time and the resources to rebuild its carrier arm. The United States, however, possessed an industrial base unmatched in scale and efficiency. Even before Midway, American shipyards were turning out new carriers at an accelerating pace. Within a year, the U.S. Navy launched the first of the Essex-class fleet carriers, while smaller escort carriers began filling the ranks of convoy protection and amphibious operations. American factories produced planes faster than Japan could destroy them. Equally important, the United States could train thousands of new pilots every month, ensuring that experience lost in battle would be quickly replenished. Thus, the consequences of Midway extended far beyond the tactical. The battle marked the moment when industrial and strategic momentum shifted irreversibly in favor of the United States. Japan's capacity to wage an offensive war had been destroyed not simply by bombs and torpedoes, but by the inability to recover from loss. In contrast, American resilience, rooted in its vast economy and adaptive command structure, guaranteed eventual victory. Beneath the abstractions of strategy and logistics lay the human dimension, the courage, error, and chance that define every battle. The aviators who flew at Midway faced overwhelming odds. Many American squadrons were wiped out entirely, particularly the torpedo bombers who attacked without fighter escort. Yet their sacrifice forced Japanese fighters to descend to sea level, leaving the skies above momentarily unguarded. It was this momentary gap that allowed the American dive bombers to strike unopposed. The victory at Midway was thus a convergence of human bravery and strategic design, a reminder that even the best plans require acts of courage to succeed. Japanese sailors and airmen fought no less bravely, but they were victims of an overconfident command structure. The assumption of invincibility led to operational rigidity. When the first American attacks began, Japanese commanders hesitated between arming their aircraft for ship attack or island strike, resulting in dangerous delays as bombs and torpedoes were shuffled back and forth on carrier decks. That hesitation, born of conflicting priorities, proved fatal. It illustrates how even momentary indecision, magnified by the pressures of battle, can undo months of preparation. The Battle of Midway continues to teach lessons relevant far beyond the realm of naval warfare. It demonstrates the interplay between intelligence, timing, and adaptability, three pillars of success that apply as much to diplomacy, technology, and business as to war. It shows that tactical brilliance, no matter how dazzling, cannot compensate for flawed grand strategy. And it underscores that true power lies not in immediate strength, but in the ability to endure, recover, and adapt. In modern military doctrine, these principles remain central. The concept of information dominance, the integration of intelligence and operational execution, traces directly back to Midway. So too does the understanding that technology alone, whether aircraft carriers in 1942 or drones and cyber tools, today is meaningless without the strategic framework to employ it effectively. The Japanese Zero was a technological marvel, but it could not win a war by itself. Its superiority in speed and maneuverability mattered little once American tactics evolved to exploit its weaknesses, and once the U.S. industrial machine began producing more robust and better-armed fighters like the F-6F Hellcat. The carriers that sank at Midway Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu took with them more than Japan's naval air power. They carried the empire's strategic hopes, the illusion that Japan could dictate the terms of the Pacific War. After Midway, Japan could no longer seize the initiative. Every subsequent battle, Guadalcanal, the Philippine Sea, Leyte Gulf, was fought on American terms. What followed was a long, bloody retreat, culminating in the devastation of 1,945. Yet Midway's legacy is not merely one of destruction or defeat. It stands as proof of how quickly the balance of power can shift when foresight, discipline, and courage align. In 5 minutes of fire and chaos, the Pacific War's trajectory changed. The lesson is enduring. The mightiest fleet, the most advanced weapons, and the most skilled warriors cannot prevail without the clarity of purpose and strategic coherence that Midway so vividly exemplified. In the decades since, military academies around the world have studied Midway as a masterclass in decision-making under uncertainty. It remains a touchstone for naval strategists, intelligence officers, and historians alike, a reminder that victory belongs not to those who fight the hardest, but to those who understand the battlefield in its entirety. The American success at Midway was not an accident of luck. It was the culmination of careful intelligence work, disciplined execution, and the humility to learn from previous failures. The Battle of Midway teaches that wars are won not merely by superior weapons, but by superior thinking. Tactical excellence can yield victories. Strategic wisdom secures them. Intelligence, patience, and adaptability transform fleeting opportunities into decisive outcomes. Industrial capacity, logistical organization, and the ability to sustain momentum determine the long-term fate of nations. Japan learned these truths through catastrophe. The United States learned them through sacrifice and discipline. Together, their experience at Midway forged one of the most enduring lessons of modern history. That mastery of information and the courage to act upon it can overturn even the greatest imbalance of power. In the end, the story of Midway is the story of how knowledge triumphed over pride, strategy over speed, and preparation over arrogance. Its lessons echo not only across the seas of 1942 but across every domain where human ambition and uncertainty collide. Up next, we have two more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.